Hello and welcome to Objective Health. I am your host Doug, and with me today are Elliot, Erica, and Tiffany.
Hello.
And today we are talking about the Cootie invasion. Very scary stuff. So I don't know if you've been paying attention to the headlines lately, but it's not even just lately. It's been over the past couple of years that it seems like there's a lot of these freak diseases, infections, crazy things just kind of popping up. Everything from like these old-timey like STDs kind of making a comeback, or even like other diseases as well, not just STDs, but other diseases and other infections kind of making a comeback that are like, medieval age diseases. But then there's other things where it's like not even things that we've ever seen before, or at least that we know of, never seen before. But it just seems like there's a lot of these kinds of weird things going on. So we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this, the mysteries, the old-timey diseases making a comeback, and just other kind of strange infections going on. So maybe we can actually start off with the STDs or STIs. I noticed when I was in school they used to call them STDs, but I think now they've changed it to STI for sexually transmitted infection as opposed to sexually transmitted disease. But there's been a number of countries that have started to report comebacks of different sexually transmitted infections. Ones that we seem to used to have kind of a handle on and they weren't really that common anymore suddenly seem to be, making a comeback. Like all of a sudden it's like, syphilis seems to be the big one. Syphilis, all of a sudden it's like it's back. And Europe in particular is really having kind of a surge in these things. And apparently Iceland is like the leader. They've
Why
had,
Iceland?
good question.
My brother Iceland was the leader in that, and I'm thinking, what's going on in Iceland? I thought it was such a serene and tranquil place. It turns out it's a hotbed for syphilis.
Yeah, I know. It's weird. Apparently they've had an 876% growth in their syphilis cases there. Whereas Ireland is second place with 224% growth, while Britain and Germany have both seen their syphilis rates more than double. So, I don't know. It's really crazy. It's kind of funny because, this article that we had about it was like an RT article. And it was basically talking about how what they were blaming it on was more or less like condoms have become less of a thing now. Like people, during the 80s, everybody was really, really careful with sex and protected sex, making sure that they were protected because of the big HIV/AIDS scare. But apparently that's kind of gone by the wayside now, at least somewhat. And people are maybe being a little bit more reckless with their sexual behavior. So they blame it on that. And they also blame it on the rise of these like dating apps. Well, dating apps, there's ones where it's basically just hookup apps. And they're saying that kind of has led to a much more promiscuous culture, which I would agree with. But they kind of blame it on those two things. That those are the things that really kind of are leading the reasons why we're starting to see these STIs come back. But what they were also saying is that they're saying that 2/3 of the cases reported between 2007 and 2017, 2/3 were men having sex with men. Whereas heterosexual men constitute about 23% of the cases and women about 15%. I don't know if that just means women in general or heterosexual women, but so it seems to be anyway, it's primarily men. Like even if you just look at heterosexual sex, it's 23% men as opposed to 15% women. So I don't know exactly why that would be. Maybe they just, we lucky men tend to harbor the infection a little bit more readily than others, than women, I mean. Yeah.
It also said in the articles we were reading about the not using condoms as much because of the fear of HIV and AIDS being not so prevalent in people's mind. So that may be why we're seeing a rise as well, because all of a sudden condoms are no longer being used to prevent these types of things.
Well, also along that line, there's the medication or prophylactic medication that some people use for HIV/AIDS. I think they call it PrEP. So people take this medication every day prophylactically to protect themselves from contracting AIDS or HIV. So whether or not it actually works, I mean, maybe that could also be a factor in people not taking HIV as seriously as they used to.
That's a prophylactic medication that works for HIV/AIDS?
Well, that's what the claim is, but yeah.
Actually, no.
In the U.S. here, we have actual drug commercials. So I've seen a few of those commercials for that medication that they call PrEP. So it's supposed to protect you against HIV. So I guess this will be an unintended consequence.
Yeah. The crazy thing is too that it's not just syphilis that's making a comeback. Apparently in the US, there's been a national surge in chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Sorry, I already mentioned syphilis, but chlamydia and gonorrhea as well are kind of reaching record highs. In 2016, there was 1.6 million cases of chlamydia, 470,000 cases of gonorrhea, and 28,000 of syphilis in the U.S. That was. So, yeah, they're all kind of making a comeback.
People are getting sluttier, or I think that's part of it. But is it also because, I don't know, maybe their immune systems are weaker and they can't fight off anything? Because I'm sure that a person could be exposed to some kind of sexually transmitted disease and not contract it if their immune system can fight it off. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the statistics for the rise in STIs, as well as the rise in a bunch of the diseases that we're going to talk about, I mean, it's not all just people having sex. I think a lot of it is decreased immunity for some reason.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point. If you consider just how much the immune system kind of has to deal with on a daily basis, things that, in the past we never really had to deal with. And I mean, the immune system was basically about pathogens more or less, but there's so many things that kind of set off the immune system now, like even to the point where it's like even food that we eat causes immune reactions in a lot of cases. So, or like, the pollution that's all around us and all these different things that lower immunity, like cell phone radiation, Wi-Fi radiation, all that kind of stuff as well. Like, I think that's a good point, Tiff. I think maybe that it might not be that there's more sex going on, or that the diseases and infections are necessarily more virulent. It might just be that we are weaker.
Mm-hmm. Because there's always been like I would call them the old school doctors, like people who used to write about health back in like the early 1900s. They were really big proponents on how it's the inner terrain, not necessarily viruses or bacteria that are attacking us. If your inner terrain is compromised for whatever reason, you're going to fall ill. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing.
I think it's a good point. Well, interestingly also, just while we're on kind of the topic of diseases in the U.S. in particular, what's going on in Los Angeles right now? Like comebacks of typhus, tuberculosis. There was one doctor recently, Dr. Drew Pinsky, who said that there is an imminent outbreak of bubonic plague because of the growth of the homeless population and the failure of the state and local authorities to deal with rodent problems. So apparently the homeless situation is so out of control in Los Angeles right now that, they're all living on Skid Row. There's piles of garbage everywhere. There's human waste everywhere, and it's causing a rat problem that's out of control, or rodents in general. And that's causing a rise of all these crazy diseases that, again, ones that, when's the last time you heard of anybody who had typhus or tuberculosis? Like in a Western country, you just don't hear about it. But apparently even over the last year, the homeless population has risen 12% to nearly 60,000 people in Los Angeles. 60,000 people living on the streets in Los Angeles. Like, that's a solid size of kind of like a medium-sized town.
Yeah, and when you say like piles of garbage, I don't know if people have a big picture of what that means, because I've looked at some YouTube videos and it's like blocks long, covering the whole sidewalk, going into the street of just garbage. They'll clean it up. Of course, that has to be a public outcry before they clean it up. But these huge piles of garbage attracting all these rats. And that's the problem, because allegedly typhus is transmitted by fleas that get on the rats and then they bite the people. So there's all this garbage and this debris. And it's not just the homeless people who are coming down with this.
No.
People who work in downtown LA, one of the, I guess she was a lawyer who worked at City Hall, she came down with typhus. Yeah. Apparently, I think this might actually be Maxine Waters' district.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
Good job, Auntie Maxine.
Well, apparently they're calling that area now the typhus zone. Like, it's got that as its nickname now. Where do you live? Oh, I'm in the typhus zone.
I think it's understandable that things would spiral down into this kind of condition, because if you think back to now I'm no expert in kind of the history of disease when it came about, but from what I understand, the basic knowledge is that many of these different kinds of diseases which were transmissible via things like rats, they're more common in couple hundred years ago, when we didn't have things like sanitation, when we didn't have sewage systems, when you had open sewers on the streets, when there was kind of mass poverty, etc. Yeah, and so it seems like us in Western civilization have moved past that, but now we're going back towards that in many of the cities. And it's not just the case in Los Angeles. It's the case in Paris. It's the case in San Francisco. It's the case in London. There is an epidemic of so-called, diseases that we have eradicated. People are starting to get them. Tuberculosis. This is becoming way more common. And it seems to parallel quite closely with this kind of rapid increase of or decrease of quality of life for certain groups of people. Homelessness is on the rise. People are shitting in the streets. I mean, Paul Joseph Watson has done several videos on this, that people actually in Paris don't want to walk in certain areas because there's too much poo on the floor. Like,
unbelievable.
There seems to be very serious health consequences of this. And I think our natural revulsion for fecal matter, it is like a biological intuitive understanding that, when you come into contact with waste, then that's a bad thing. But when you have the governors and the council members and the heads of these cities investing more of their resources in transgender, liberal, ideological, bloody policies, which no one really cares about, and then they actually deprive the people of the city living in the city, they deprive them of basic things like toilets and toilet rolls and medicines and things. It's like the natural outcome of something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's my impression anyway.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point.
Maybe this is kind of like a top-down situation. I mean, the policies, like you were saying, Elliot, the policies, the corruption, the people in government not really caring about their constituents, all of this leads to the homelessness, the poverty, which causes the overcrowding in the cities and the tent cities. And then that leads to the pileup of garbage and the pooing in the streets. So it's not like any of this can be looked at outside of or just in isolation. I think that if you look at society as a whole, I think we're disintegrating in multiple ways. And this is just a physical health aspect of the general disintegration of cultures across the world.
Yeah. And as they say, as above, so below. But there's also that kind of aesthetically, when you see junk on the street, piles of junk in a really modern city, a wealthy city, piles of junk, feces on the floor, homeless people, drug addicts, crime. It's like perhaps that's an external manifestation of what is happening on a collective level, either locally or collectively, at least in the West. So yeah, it's interesting how that kind of plays out. But it's funny because actually what you're saying about that Tiff, the systemic corruption and the real the lack of care that these elites have for the kind of populace as a whole, that is going to come to bite them in the bum eventually, because the people in these cities, the homelessness is going to continue to grow, very likely. The disease rates are increasing, and it's like disease doesn't really specify who it gets per se. There is, of course, the innate kind of immune aspect to it. So, okay, if you have a healthy, robust immune system, then you might be better off to protect against these things. But if you've got a disease, something like typhus or Ebola in Los Angeles, something, some kind of epidemic, then that's going to take out a lot of people potentially.
Well, and things like TB have been around excuse me, for a long time. I grew up in San Francisco, and it was prevalent in the homeless back in the 70s. And a big part of it is, spreading through breathing and microbes and whatnot. But it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort to just have people tested and to, try and deal with the situation. But as you were saying, Elliot and Tiffany, it's like, those people are just kind of pushed aside, and until somebody like the lawyer in Los Angeles gets sick, nobody really cares. But there can be ways of addressing it so it doesn't continue to spread through the population.
Yeah. Well, maybe cleaning up all that garbage would work. Just a thought. I don't know.
Start at least.
Yeah, totally. I know that they were talking about fumigating a lot of the city buildings. Like they had fumigated a police station or something like that had been fined because it was so infested. And I think there were a couple of other kind of city-owned buildings where, city employees were working and stuff like that, where this woman was working who ended up getting typhus. So, but that just seems like kind of Band-Aid solutions. Like, honestly, you can fumigate a building, but if right outside there's giant piles of garbage, like, it's probably not going to stay clean for very long. It reminds me of actually when I was first moved out on my own. I was a student, and I lived in an absolute shithole of an apartment building, and there were roaches. And what they would do is they would come in and they would spray for roaches in one part of the building, so all the roaches would run to another part of the building, and then they just come back again. They go to spray another place, and they'd just come back to the other place. Like, they'd come in and they'd spray our part of the building. We had to leave for a day or something like that. And then we'd come back and we'd have like a couple of days of no roaches, and all of a sudden they'd be back again. It's the same idea. Like, unless you get to kind of the root cause of the problem, you're gonna have these pests show up again, and it's not going to do anything about this disease.
And the same is with rats, the same exact applications of, eliminating one where they just move from building to building. And, when you think about people being quote unquote activists, and you see, I don't know if you folks have seen this whole pressure to clean up all the plastic in the ocean. And that's a great thing, but why aren't people, especially in a place like Los Angeles? I mean, there's over, 1 million people, maybe even more, maybe 8 million or something, that they wouldn't be these, grassroots organizations that are like, hey, let's spend our Saturday dealing with the trash in our city.
Well, they probably don't want to, because they'll end up with typhus. Or tuberculosis. Apparently in 2013, they actually identified a new strain of tuberculosis that was circulating among the homeless population. So it was like basically a brand new version of tuberculosis.
It's the LA strain of TB?
I guess so, yeah. The fancy Los Angeles version of tuberculosis.
Well, believe it or not, they do have a test and a prick, it's not an immunization, but if you test for tuberculosis in your lungs, then they can give you a skin test. You know what I mean? And I don't know, do you know, Tiff, what they treat tuberculosis with? Is there a treatment?
I forget the specific name of the antibiotic, but it turns your pee orange. But a problem with treating tuberculosis, especially if you're homeless and maybe you're using drugs or something, you have to really be compliant with that, and it lasts for several weeks at least. So if you're not going to take your antibiotics over the course of several weeks to a couple months, then you're not going to get cured from the TB.
Got it.
So yeah, compliance would probably be an issue there.
Yeah.
Well, crazy. What else can we talk about? How about the plague of Lyme disease that seems to be stretching across the entire world at the moment? Lyme, it seems like Lyme is kind of everywhere. And while the officials won't kind of recognize that there's any such thing as chronic Lyme disease, they say that it's only an acute condition, It's just an acute condition, and that a course of antibiotics takes care of it, and then there's nothing to worry about. Whereas what people are experiencing, and what many Lyme literate MDs are actually documenting and talking about, is that the infection can become chronic, and it is much, much, much worse when it becomes chronic.
But there's some health officials who won't even admit that chronic Lyme disease is a thing.
Yeah, including the CDC.
There was an investigation into it as to why. And there was a lot of conflicts of interest turning up. Either some of the people on the panels that were deciding on this chronic Lyme disease, whether it existed or not, some of those people had links to test kit manufacturers for Lyme disease. Some of them were linked to pharmaceutical companies. So it's all a big mess. But I don't understand why the CDC would seem to be so against that. I guess the same thing, like we did a show on Morgellons disease back before we came to YouTube. So the CDC doesn't want to admit that Lyme can be a chronic problem, just like they don't admit that Morgellons disease exists. And I always wonder, why would the CDC not want to admit to a disease being prevalent? They're all about diseases. I mean, that's their whole thing. It seems like maybe they can make some money off of it. They make money off of lots of other things, but why? And then there's these whispers that, maybe Lyme disease has been weaponized.
Yeah.
So, when you consider that, maybe that is one of the reasons why the CDC doesn't want to cop up to the truth about Lyme disease. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that the doctor who originally is said to have kind of discovered Lyme, his name was Bergdorfer, I believe, and that's what the Borrelia burgdorferi was actually named after, which is the name of the infection. But it was interesting to read that he apparently was a bioweapons specialist. Yeah, like he actually like specialized in creating or kind of researching techniques to use kind of biological materials or life forms in the form of bacteria and things to actually use as a, to use as a weapon against enemies. I guess if, that could be anyone, and actually kind of neutralize your targets using like a bacteria. So that's the kind of stuff that they were researching, right? Mm-hmm. And then you've got the widespread denial on the part of kind of mainstream medicine, conventional medicine, and health policy that this doesn't even exist. Yet there's up to 300,000 cases which are diagnosed every year, and there are people who are literally completely sick with this disease, and not many people even believe that they have it.
Yeah.
Well, one problem with that is that the Lyme disease tests are highly inaccurate. Like when you read about Lyme disease, I always say, oh, look for that bullseye rash. But less than half of the people who come down with Lyme disease actually get that bullseye rash.
Yeah.
And then the tests are often inconclusive, or they give a false negative result. Because I think that they source the test for the test kit. They source the bacterium from one tick, and they got it down to like one specimen, but it came from a tick. It wasn't like Lyme that had infected someone else. So they're testing all these new cases against this one specimen, and it doesn't even apply to all these people. Like if you're in Europe and you come down with Lyme disease and you take a test in the US, it might not even detect it, and vice versa.
Well, it's funny because that bullseye rash, like that, the thing is, one thing that is also kind of controversial and not widely disseminated, but a lot of doctors are actually saying that you don't only get Lyme disease from tick bites. Like the mainstream perspective is like the only way you can get Lyme disease is from a tick. You can't get it from another person. You can't get it from, your pets or anything like that. But that's actually turning out to not be true. Apparently, there was a study that had showed the strong possibility that Lyme is actually sexually transmitted, or can be sexually transmitted. They did a study. I don't remember the details exactly, but they were looking at kind of married couples, and they would find Lyme in the semen or vaginal secretions of the couple that were identical. So, I mean, obviously they had kind of passed from one person, or it's very likely that they had passed from one person to another. You can also get it from urine. They have found the spirochetes, like the bacteria, in urine from like pets. Or feces of pets. So if you're kind of cleaning up after your pets, you might actually get them. And you can actually get it from pets as well. I mean, if a tick jumps from your pet onto you, but that's still technically through a tick. But I mean, the point is that they don't really seem to know very much about Lyme disease. The fact that they think it can only come from a tick is obviously wrong. Or I shouldn't say it's obviously wrong, but it's likely wrong. I mean, the virulence of this disease and where it's found suggests that it is not only from tick transmission.
And for those that do get that remember, a lot of patients don't even remember over 64% being bitten by a tick. But the ones that there's over 30 different pathogens that can be co-infections with the Lyme's disease as well. and they don't respond to the standard treatment of antibiotic application, those co-infections. So again, kind of like we were talking about in the beginning of the show, it's this, I'm wondering if it's this breakdown of the immune system and what maybe people normally would be able to fight it off. But now, as you were saying in the beginning, Doug, that, you know, their immune systems just have that little window of opening, and these 30 other possibilities break down the body as well.
Well, I mean, the other thing is too, if they, well, maybe just to back up a bit, there was a representative, Chris Smith, who actually, what was it? He was asking the Department of Defense to investigate the possible involvement of the Department of Defense biowarfare labs in the weaponization of Lyme disease in ticks and other insects from 1950 to 1975. So he actually did this, like, officially. He's kind of like asking them for this information. I'd say, like, if they actually were doing that, and he's basing a lot of this on a book that was called Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by a gentleman named Chris Newby. And they actually interview that guy, Dr. Bergdorfer, is that his name? Who was a bioweapon specialist. So basically, if this actually was something, and it looks like it probably was, then what's to say that Lyme disease wasn't actually created in and of itself? Like, that the disease itself wasn't an invention? Because apparently it's quite similar to syphilis, oddly enough, which we were talking about at the beginning of the show. So maybe it's just genetically modified syphilis that they put into ticks to infect us all.
Yeah, I think one of the pathologists who studies Lyme was saying that because he was hearing about, like, primary and secondary and tertiary phases of Lyme disease that kind of mirrored all the symptoms of primary, secondary, and tertiary syphilis. And the fact that the spirochetes of Lyme disease and syphilis are like cousins, it just seems like a huge coincidence.
I wonder if they basically were making this or experimenting with it as a way of kind of attacking the enemies of the state, and some got out of the lab or something along those lines. Yeah. Or who knows, maybe they decided to turn it on their own population. It actually wouldn't surprise me.
Wouldn't they think about the long-term effects of something like that, no. They're not immune as well?
They never do.
I mean, maybe they went after the preppers, you know, people that live in the forest and don't have a lot of urban development around them, and, you know, don't go outside. I don't know. Maybe,
you know, while we're on the kind of tinfoil hat subject, we could talk about, there's another tick-borne illness that actually makes people allergic to meat. And I remember when this kind of first was coming about, it was a couple of years ago when there were rumors of this kind of circulating, but it turned out to actually be a thing. And I remember there was a lot of people kind of in the keto paleo community who were like, oh, they're doing it on purpose. They're trying to stop us from eating meat and being ketogenic and all this kind of stuff. You know, it sounds kind of crazy, but still at the same time, maybe they're like, no, the ketogenic diet is the pathway to transformation. We got to mute that. We got to nip that in the bud. What can we do? Oh, I know, a meat allergy. We'll just stick it in this tick.
I don't know. Who can say? But, you know, there are crazy people in the world, and there are forces at work that we can't really fathom. So, I don't know. There's lots of possibilities, at least for me.
Yeah. I think so. Sure. Well, what else can we talk about? How about treatment-resistant fungal infections?
Yay.
So
go away.
Yeah. So apparently, there's been a lot of kind of press about antibacterial resistance and antibacterial resistant bacteria. That basically there are these bacterias like MRSA or any numbers of other ones that are resistant to antibacterials. It's like they have developed the ability to not be affected by antibacterials. Well, apparently the same thing is happening with fungal infections. There are a number of fungal infecting agents that are no longer responding to antifungal drugs. And there are a number of people out there who have these fungal infections that are basically they're not able to treat them. They can't do anything about them because they're completely resistant to these antifungal drugs that have always worked in the past. There's some speculation that this actually isn't from an overuse of antifungal drugs like it has been with the antibacterials, but that it actually is because they use antifungals to treat food crops as well. And that by having those sprayed on the food crops, then you're kind of getting a little bit every time you eat some. So that ends up kind of lightly exposing some of these fungi to these antifungals, which is how they basically build up resistance. So it might actually rather than like blaming the medical cartel on this one, it might actually be because of farming.
Yeah.
Well, and the ability for these types of microbes to adapt. So if you're being exposed to them in your gut and, you have to continue adapting, it would make sense that like what would it be what's a good example of a fungus? Toenail fungus is one that I think of, like, this chronic overgrowth, and they just keep adapting, and pretty soon it's going to be like super fungus, just like going back to the agriculture model of super weeds. You keep using this stuff on the food and then it gets into people's body and people are adapting.
Well,
fungus
apparently
is adapting.
Yeah. Well, apparently like it's particularly bad with lung diseases because apparently the lungs are a good place for like certain types of fungus to actually take hold. It's warm, it's moist, kind of perfect conditions for like a fungus. And if untreated, those things can actually form like tumorous masses in the lungs. Cause it can kill people. And also, people who have asthma are quite susceptible to these infections, particularly if they're using the inhalers, because that apparently is not so good for the immune system. So it brings the immune system down, and then the fungus can actually take hold. So a lot of people with asthma are in danger of getting these treatment-resistant fungal infections.
I think that a lot of people who are immunocompromised, whether it's because of overuse of steroid asthma medications or because they had cancer at some point and had chemotherapy, or if they have any kind of autoimmune disorder, I think a lowered immune system plays a big part in a lot of these diseases that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But not at the beginning, but I think this is particularly true of these fungal infections, because a lot of the people that die are like in ICUs and hospitals.
Well, what else, guys? What other crazy diseases are right around the corner threatening us all?
Well, there's treatment-resistant candida.
Is there?
Yeah, I think they found the first case in Japan in 2009, and then it spread to places like, I think, South Africa, some place in South America and the U.S. And mostly people get it in hospitals, which are really gross places. So they have, the beds in hospitals, and once a patient is discharged, they're supposed to come in and totally disinfect the bed. But there's a lot of nooks and crannies and stuff in those hospital beds, and course, you have to consider like how well the staff is cleaning or what products that they're using. And then sometimes, even with the best techniques, these funguses or fungi develop resistance to any kind of normal cleaning methods. So, yeah, if you can avoid being in a hospital, try to stay out of them because they're really dirty places.
Yeah, it kind of seems ironic that where you go, the place that you go to when you're the most vulnerable, physically speaking, when you are the most sick and you are the most vulnerable to any kind of superbug or killer infection, it's ironic that that place is is actually the place which harbors the most deadly infections in today's age. But what can you expect when you adopt a kind of a framework by which you, like this whole notion that actually attacking bacteria with antibiotics is the be all and end all, and actually there's not going to be any negative consequences of that further on down the line. It's like the doctors who originally started using antibiotics were warning against this. They've been warning against this for a very long time, saying save these antifungals, antibiotics, antivirals, save these things for, end stage, last resort kind of scenarios where you've tried everything else and nothing works. Save it till that, because you are going to see resistance. And no one listened. And in fact, they just went ahead and started prescribing copious amounts for things that weren't even bacterially related, right? Yeah, so you got a viral infection, have some antibiotics.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, well, now this is the logical progression. Bacteria, fungi, they are much like any other species. They will, detect what's going on in the environment and come up with they'll network with one another, because that's what we do. They'll network and they'll basically devise a way to overcome that barrier and actually proliferate under different conditions. And so, it just seems like we're probably going to be seeing this a lot more.
Yeah.
And just with the fungal infections as well, the antibacterials, I mean, using those in our food, like in cattle and pigs and chickens and all that stuff, just feeding them antibiotics, not because it's necessary, because they have an infection or anything like that, but it makes them grow bigger and faster and fatter. So that's another place where we're getting exposed as well.
And also this idea of being too clean all the time, and that the hygiene hypothesis, the obsession, like I get with the hospital, like needing to sterilize and whatnot, but even in everyday life and even with starting very young with children, like being really almost obsessive with cleanliness, in the sense that, washing with the triclosan, the antibacterial soaps, everything is sterilized, and not giving the body an opportunity to kind of adapt to normal things in the environment. And that may be fungus, that may be things that, that could proliferate, but not going to those extreme measures to kill it off. And it just seems like kind of the theme of our show is how really out of balance everything is, and how it's just going to extreme levels. And I'm not telling people not to wash their hands, but just being obsessive to the point, like with the Clorox wipes, and you know what I mean? It's hard to say. I don't know if I'm getting my point across. I just feel like it becomes really extreme. And I think people, and I know you shared this before, Doug, on maybe even a previous show here that we had on YouTube, but that just fear of anything that's not sanitary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It does seem to be a bit extreme. How this kind of obsession with cleanliness, over cleanliness.
I mean, we had an article that we carried on SOT. It was back in 2012, but it's called The Hygiene Hypothesis and Can Being Too Clean Harm Your Health? And there was a study done about the suppressed immune system of adults, and they were talking about how the immune system learns how to fight illness and disease by being exposed to it. It then builds defenses. And when we don't allow that to happen by normal exposure to microorganisms, then the immune system doesn't know how to fight off these things, and then we become vulnerable. And I think we're seeing that in these very subtle ways with the outbreak of candida, resistance and fungus resistance, and I mean a lot of different things. Even in the environment, we're seeing it with these red tides and outgrowth of algae, and making people sick in their respiratory system. I mean, it just seems like everything is so screwed.
Yeah,
flesh-eating bacteria like necrotizing fasciitis.
Yeah,
which basically just like tears someone up from inside out and just can devour the skin and the flesh on their leg in the space of like 6 hours. So someone goes to sleep and wakes up with barely any leg. That is actually what's happening. And like on the the East Coast, the US, Florida, this is actually becoming like quite a common thing now. It wasn't necessarily reported until couple years ago, and now it's becoming really quite common, particularly on the east coast of the US for whatever reason. But there have been cases where people have literally gone out for a stroll on the coast, walking through some shallow waters, warm waters, say on the Florida coast, and come back and they've got a small itch or like maybe a pimple or what seems to be a bite. And then they'll come down with a fever that night. The next day, they might be rushed into hospital because they've gone into some kind of metabolic crisis kind of thing. And then they'll be pronounced dead sort of within 24 hours, 48 hours, because they've contracted this flesh-eating disease that's basically, eaten half of their chest.
Yeah.
And if I don't recommend anyone doing it, but, for those who are interested in the physiology, go ahead and type it in onto YouTube or onto Google or something, and you can see it, and it is real. It's like these kinds of infections, they can't be treated unless you get it very quickly. And so one of the recommendations is to kind of, if you do come up with any kind of graze, cut, or bite after, being in water or whatever like that. I mean, you don't even have to be in the water. You could just be walking on the beach. It makes it a bit difficult because most of us get cuts and scratches on the beach. But they say that if you develop a fever after that or anything, you develop any strange kind of symptoms which are not don't seem related to what would normally occur, then, get it checked out. And because it could potentially be something quite nasty. And I'm interested into why on earth this is happening now. I'm thinking, is it probably a conglomeration of factors? So you've got like the chemical aspect, which is you've got a bunch of crap being released into the ocean, basically. So you've got plastics, you've got chemicals, you've got stuff which is, industrial pollutants going up into the sky. They're coming down into the rainwater and polluting the sea, the oceans, killing the fish and probably destroying the whole microbiome. So I'm guessing that there's some factor there involved, perhaps allowing, some kind of pathogen, weird bacteria. It's changing the balance in some way. And that seems to be actually quite detrimental to humans. So there's that aspect to it. There's also the EMF. So it's like, okay, do we know how bacteria respond to that? I mean, I wrote an article on it a couple of years ago, and it's like when you expose certain types of bacteria to electromagnetic radiation, then some of them become antibiotic resistant. Some of them actually develop certain resistant strains and become more pathogenic. kind of more damaging to human beings. That is a possibility as well. Is that what's happening? Are they picking up on that? Then there's also the kind of extraterrestrial factor of, there's been, over the past few years, not so much in the past year or two, but in the past decade, we've had massive increases of fireballs, meteorites, these kind of things coming into the atmosphere. And it's like, well, we wouldn't even know how many of those dump into the ocean. And there's a couple of scientists in the past who've basically posited that, well, these things can harbor certain viruses and things, which when they're introduced into the, within the Earth's atmosphere and actually kind of plummet down into Earth, that they can be extremely pathogenic for human beings, that they can wipe out entire civilizations potentially. So there's that. And then there's also, are these bacteria kind of just responding to the fluctuation in solar activity, which is also happening? So stuff's going kind of crazy on a level of physics with the Earth. It's like things are changing in some way. No, I don't know if anyone knows, but the weather is going crazy and people are going crazy as well. I mean, we talk about this all the time. So it's like, why wouldn't bacteria go crazy?
Yeah.
It's only expected. So it's like, I'm kind of excited to see what's going to come of this stuff. How far is it going to go? Are we going to have mutant bacteria, turning people into zombies and stuff? I mean, my
thought always goes to zombies too, Elliot.
Yeah, zombies. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are.
You just got to sit back and watch the show, haven't you? And try to do what you can to boost your own immune system, hopefully so that you don't become a zombie.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should talk about that. How can we deal with the fact that there are all these crazy freaking diseases and stuff? I mean, you don't want to be super paranoid about this kind of stuff and become one of those people who basically walks around like a bubble suit, has a mask on and all that kind of stuff because they're afraid of all the possible exposures to these diseases and things. But I mean, we've mentioned it a couple of times how the state of one's immune system kind of is really what's going to dictate whether or not these things affect you or how badly they affect you. So what do you think? What can we do to boost our immune systems?
I'd say that one thing that you can do, not necessarily what you should add, but something that you shouldn't do is take vaccines. Because, and I'll go back to syphilis here, there's a lot of speculation and a lot of old books written about how they were trying to eradicate smallpox or get rid of smallpox and vaccinate against smallpox. And they ended up causing syphilis with the smallpox vaccine. So you never know when you start injecting foreign matter into yourself, you never know what's going to happen. So that is one way to avoid any kind of towards your immune system unnecessarily.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's better to kind of build up a natural immunity to these things anyway. In my personal opinion, everybody has to do their own research and figure it out as far as vaccines are concerned. But I think you make a pretty persuasive argument, Tiff. But yeah, I think, just in general, eating the right foods, getting enough sleep, those are actually really important as far as keeping your immune system in functioning order, not getting too much exposure to electromagnetic radiation. All the things that we talk about pretty much on every show, those are things that you can work into your lifestyle that will naturally kind of keep your immune system functioning properly. Like just, missing a night of sleep or not getting enough sleep for enough consecutive days will have a definite effect on your immune system. Sleep, people, it seems to be kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost like something to be lauded, to be able to go with as little sleep as possible. It's like, oh yeah, I'm so busy, I'm getting no sleep. And people are like, oh yeah, good for you, man. You're working hard. Mm-hmm. But really, it's like you're really damaging yourself by doing that. So yeah, I think those kind of simple lifestyle factors are important steps to kind of keeping your immune system in proper functioning order.
Yeah, I'd like to add to the importance of reducing stress. Mm-hmm. So we did a show on it last week because, as you were saying, Doug, that lack of sleep, then you eat bad food, the stress component too. I mean, you can just worry yourself till your immune system's shot as well. So really addressing stressors in your life and making sure that they don't get the best of you in that sense. And, even kind of on a light note, going back to that hygiene hypothesis of not being so worried about everything being clean all the time. And, just, I don't know, it can really exhaust you mentally and then physically as well.
Yeah. So just for boosting immunity, there's a couple of things which can help as well. So there's some pretty good studies on vitamin D, actually. So there's lots of kind of mechanisms which have been laid out as to why vitamin D is kind of useful in terms of like it's upregulating certain types of genes which protect your cells from these pathogens and stuff. And theoretically, like, it makes sense, but actually there is some human trials using vitamin D and finding that it does have beneficial effects on their kind of inflammatory markers, on their recovery time and that kind of stuff. So if you do come down with some kind of infection, I think some extra vitamin D might help. Ideally, if you're getting enough sunlight, if you're eating kind of enough animal fats and that kind of stuff, then vitamin D should be in a good place. There's a herb, one herb, it's called, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's called, is it astragalus?
Astragalus.
Astragalus, yeah. So astragalus has typically been used to boost the immune system in the past. And I think you would use it as soon as you felt that you were coming down with something. And I'm not sure if it can be used in any of these really kind of horrible conditions like TB. Yeah. I know that high dose vitamin C can be and has been effectively used for that. Ideally, like IV vitamin C, if you can get hold of that. But apparently astragalus can also be given in IV, and it's pretty good when it's in IV. So yeah, if you have access to IV, you could have vitamin C and astragalus. But it's generally good for that. And then there's also other things like zinc acetate and stuff. But ideally, if you're eating enough red meat, then I think you should be in a pretty good position.
Yeah.
As long as you're not vegan, then you don't want to be a vegan and come into contact with some of these nasty infections, because then that's not going to be good. But then if you get something like MRSA on your skin, let's say that you go to the hospital, you come down with MRSA, you have like the skin infection. We've covered this on the show, but there's a couple of accounts of people using like kombucha topically.
Yeah.
I would probably go for colloidal silver, iodine, kefir, kombucha. Yeah. Just off the top of my head. Anyone else think of anything that might be helpful?
Yeah.
I think just taking those foods like fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, building up the microbiome, so your gut can fight off, especially the internal types of things that go on. As you were saying, kombucha, not a big fan of how that tastes, but
I like it.
But fermented foods, great, kind of information overload in the fermented food area, but finding those beneficial microbes in your food.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I think that's we've covered quite a bit there. That's probably our show. Unless you guys, did you have anything else you wanted to add about anything? Freaky diseases, immune boosting.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much, and there's so much
Yeah.
stuff.
We didn't even talk about Ebola, so.
We'll have to save it for another show.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of Objective Health. We will be back with another show next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe below, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.